Government debt now exceeds 3 trillion rand, which is more than 60% of the country's GDP. The very high debt is now at levels recorded at the end of apartheid. Poorly performing and failing state-owned enterprises are putting enormous pressure on government. These are some of the contents of a report released yesterday by the Centre for Development Enterprises titled "Running Out of Road: South Africa's Public Finances and What is to be Done." Joining us now, we've got Ann Bernstein, who's the Executive Director at the Centre for Development Enterprises, to discuss the report. Good to see you, Ann. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
So, what inspired the report and how long has it actually been worked on for?
Well, CDE normally looks at development issues, jobs, education, things like that. But we became very concerned about the size of debt and the impact that it is having on growth in the country. So we've been working on this with some of the leading economists in South Africa, and we released it yesterday as a contribution to trying to communicate the seriousness of the situation that South Africa is in, where our finances are really precarious and our macroeconomics, our fundamentals are unsound, and we're on a path for an explosive debt growth. And this has an enormous impact on ordinary citizens like you and me, and on the country as a whole.
Well, it certainly does, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it everywhere we turn and everywhere we look. But let's get to the fundamentals of this. And as I said in the introduction, that debt for South Africa exceeds 60% of the country's GDP. I mean, it's back at the highest levels recorded during apartheid. What is going on?
Well, to put it very simply, in 2008, with the global financial crisis, South Africa's growth started to decline, and we didn't adjust. We didn't say, gee, growth is declining, we're going to get less tax revenue, we should cut our expenditure. We kept assuming, and our projections of growth every year were that our growth rate would be higher than it actually was. So we've misaligned the amount of money we collect in tax and state expenditure, both in the government and in the state-owned companies. And we've allowed this to get out of control. At the same time, as revenue was declining and growth was stagnating, South Africa decided to expand the civil service and to increase public sector wages at an unprecedented rate, 11% per annum over the last decade.
Now, if we look at what government should be doing, because the reality is that from what you're saying, what the report has said, is that government hasn't adequately responded to dealing with the situation. What is that urgent intervention that's needed now?
Well, it's not just one, unfortunately. We need to do a number of things. We have to stop these bailouts to failing state-owned companies. Either their revenue must increase or their expenditure must come down, and we have to restructure how we think about the markets for each of those companies. So if you think of Eskom or SAA, we need to look at, can these be viable enterprises? How do we fix them? But we've got to make decisions quickly. We've got to be bold, and we have to be decisive. In terms of state expenditure, we have to look at not so much the numbers of people that has started to come down over the last 2 years, but the rate of the pressure on wages, that they just can't keep rising at the rate they have, much higher than the private sector. So there's some big issues about the size of the state, about how many people it can afford to employ and at what rates. But in addition to that, the most important issue is we have to get growth going. So the weight of the debt now affects our chance of getting faster economic growth. And the slow economic growth means that our debt keeps expanding if we don't cut expenditure. So growth is really important, and the Minister of Finance is saying that in his document yesterday, and we're saying that too. We're saying that we have to make the essential reforms that are required to get this economy growing again.
Sell off some of the state-owned enterprises, privatize it, split them up. What is the way to do that? Because we all keep saying that we need to see growth, But how? With these state-owned enterprises weighing so heavily on the economy, what do we do?
Well, A few things. We have to look at each state-owned enterprise, the big ones, and decide what is the best thing for South Africa, not for a political party or for the people working there, but what's best for South Africa. And that will differ from each entity. And so we're saying we can't continue with endless bailouts. Some state-owned companies must be allowed to fail if that is the right decision. Some must be restructured. We came out with, in February, the president said this is what he was going to do with Eskom, but nothing's happened. So we need to act. So each market, whether it's for transport and the trains or electricity or aviation, each market needs to be looked at. There will be occasions where, in our view, we should be bringing the private sector in and privatizing, and then it's very important that you have a competitive market. But in addition to that, the key things that are holding us back in terms of growth is we need a different attitude to business and markets. We need to say that how do we free up firms to expand and start new companies? How do we get investment going? You can't do that if you're undermining property rights. You can't do that if the enormous corruption in key state institutions continues. So SARS is a key institution that has to be fixed as soon as possible. So it's a different kind of attitude. The country needs a new economic growth strategy. And what we need most of all is leadership. What's important is the future of South Africa and not the unity of a particular political party. So the depth of change that's required needs enormous leadership from the president and his team and an effective effort at communicating with South Africans through the breadth of the land on the difficult situation we're in and what has to be done.
You also, you mentioned corruption, and you spoke to, in the report, perhaps redirecting some of these funds that are going into failed state institutions, state-owned institutions, and rather putting them towards institutions like the NPA to try and rid crime as a way of what's become a norm in South Africa.
Absolutely.
And that is a big thing. So, I mean, let's talk to that.
So the big issue is, how does South Africa use its resources that we have in the best possible way for all South Africans? So if you and I were talking and we said, should we give more money to the NPA to prosecute the crooks who have stolen state money from you and me, and particularly poorer South Africans, or should we give money to a failing SA Express or SAA? I think the answer is clear. So how we prioritize where we put our money is a vital issue. And that requires some hard decisions. It requires changing some policies that we have sort of held to very firmly for the last 20 years, and taking implementing the discipline that's needed. So we stop spending money we don't have. We estimate the period 2015 to 2022, the government is going to be borrowing R1 billion every single day. Think about that. Somebody's got to pay this back. So we need to choose some priorities for this society. We need to change direction in many areas, and we need leadership that is going to be bold and courageous.
Just finally, one of the big statements that you actually said was the fact that we should allow our state-owned enterprises, or some of our state-owned enterprises, to fail. You look at some of them, for instance, Eskom, which is the biggest burden and one of the biggest ones that is failing right now. How do we allow that to fail when you have a choice between electricity and running a country?
No. We're not saying, we're very careful to say some SOCs must be allowed to fail if that's appropriate. We certainly can't allow Eskom to fail. We all need electricity every minute of every day. We have to fix Eskom so that it does provide the electricity we need, and we need to do that in new ways. We need to open up the market so private producers can come in. We've been very successful in getting that going. We need to continue, but we've got to restructure Eskom. We're going to have to cut costs at Eskom. But that's not one that we're suggesting should fail.
Which one would you suggest?
No, we're not saying. We're saying you need to look at each one and the market in which they operate and say, there are no holy cows here. If this cannot work, SA Express is a good example. It looks extremely unlikely that it could survive. It wouldn't make any difference to South Africa if tomorrow that didn't exist. So we need to think hard about each entity. I know you want to ask me about the SABC, but I'm extremely ignorant about this. We need to look at each one, what's best for South Africa, and we need to say, how big should our state be? Why is it so important to have a bigger and bigger state when actually they can't deal with the most basic aspects of their mandate?
Yeah.
So if we said corruption and getting rid of corruption, getting the crooks out of the system is the most important thing, let's concentrate on that. Let's concentrate on the roads. Let's concentrate on the basics like policing and doing this effectively and ensuring that people actually do their jobs and look at what the markets and the private sector can provide for South Africans more efficiently, more affordably. So we need to rethink these issues, and we should stop sort of pretending that if we keep doing exactly what we've been doing for the last 10 years, things are going to be the same.
They're not. To be business unusual is what you're saying.
Business unusual.
Absolutely.
And real leadership and communication of why South Africa has to make some hard trade-offs in order to get the economy going again.
And thanks very much for talking to us. That was Ann Bernstein. She's an executive director at the Center for Development Enterprises, discussing the report released yesterday on the state of the country's economy. Well worth reading. Go out there and have a look. Go to the website for the Center of Development Enterprises.